And obviously, there's some great feedback around this. Is hopefully these webinars will hopefully give coaches that extra bit of like support and ideas when we can finally get back to our coaching environments and hopefully all get through this stronger and better individuals. So I'm going to move on to the developing training programs for young athletes now. Again, same principle. If you've got any questions, fire them through. We'll try and pause at certain points. And then any comments that you want to share, please do. Great conversations going on at the moment. So in terms of this particular area, as I say, I wanted to talk about planning. Is one of them things I think sometimes we don't always do because it's quite challenging. And I work with athletes, as I say, in a very broad spectrum. So I'm working with one athlete who was aiming for the Olympics this year, and unfortunately, obviously, that's now been delayed for obvious and sensible reasons. But you're writing a training program for somebody like that, which is quite detailed, and you're trying to plan where they're going to be at least 1 year, maybe even 4 years in advance. And then we've got the other end of the spectrum where we're working with youngsters who are just infrequently joining clubs, and we're trying to give them some level of structure around what they're doing and how they can develop skill. So this is more around what does the philosophy around the plan look like, and how can we probably make sure it's appropriate for the younger end of the spectrum. So hopefully it's really useful for people on the call. It may be that we need to just pose a few questions if it's for an older age group you're interested in, and I'll do my best. And obviously, as I say, I've got Spencer on the call with me as well, who is an expert in the endurance field and working with the elite level. So I thought I'd start with this slide. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And I think that's a beautiful way to look at planning and long-term athlete development. And I remember listening to David Hemery, who won the Olympics and broke the world record in the 4 hurdles, I believe in Mexico in 1968. And he talked about that he was doing a horrible training session, and he was flat on the floor and he couldn't get up. And the assistant coach was sent over by his coach and said, "You've got a short amount of time before you have to run the next rep." And he was arguing, I physically can't do it. I haven't got anything left in my legs. And the encouragement from his coach was, just take the first step, David. That's all you need to do. And what happened after that is he took the first step and he finished the repetition. Now, this is all about sometimes when you're going into uncharted territory, take the first step and then build from there. And so what I want you to think about with planning is, how do we build a plan? It might be we start simple and then build from there. So typically where I think an annual plan would start from, and I'm going to talk about general rules in terms of planning before we get into the more of the youth age group, is that we almost need to feed back to feed forwards. And what that means is I need to get feedback from where my athletes are to understand how I start to develop what the plan will look like for the next year. So if I know where my athletes are in terms of their physical conditioning, their mental preparation, their technical ability, etc., it gives me a chance to understand what I need to build into the elements of their training and the plan moving forwards. And that's not dissimilar to what would be the case if it's a whole new group of young people joining the club at the age of 8, 9, 10, 11. I almost need to understand what they do outside the sport. I need to understand how active they are in school. Are they doing lots of PE lessons? Are they doing lots of other sports elsewhere? What are the sort of things that they already do, which will really complement the training that they do and help them and give me a greater understanding of maybe where I can encourage them to challenge themselves more, or maybe support them when they might struggle. So the first step should always be understanding where they are, to structure the plan that's moving forwards. I think when we talk about young people, though, there's going to be some key aspects that I want to add in as well around us as coaches considering how we manage the bigger group. There's loads of language that's out there in terms of planning, and there's this term periodized, and I'll explain that quickly. And what coaches typically tend to decide is whether they're doing a single or double periodized year for more experienced, like top end athletes, which would be an example would be a single periodized year is that my training is orientated towards being at my best shape, my peak, maybe for the outdoor season. That might be my goal. And there'll be different points along that goal where I want to be in good shape. British trials in terms of preparation for the major event there. A double periodized year, it may be for an endurance athlete. I'm focusing on the cross country season and the track outdoor season, or it may be I'm focusing on the indoor and the outdoor season. So I've got two defined peaks in the actual training program. But the question we should also say is, do we need a periodized year for young people? Are they focusing, or are we just generally making sure they have fun, engaging activities, and where they're enjoying themselves? There still could be competition in there. We're just not changing the training to peak for a certain point. So we'll explore that a little bit as we go through. And once we've decided that, we can look at all the other aspects. And again, this language in this first slide is more generic planning and probably more like adult experienced athletes orientated. But we can look at how long the periods and phases of training are. So that's the broader aspects of that general preparation and like how long that's going to be. And then there's things called mesocycle and microcycles. Essentially, the way I look at the mesocycle is a 4-week period for me, which is in that 4 weeks, what type of training I'm going to do for the athletes before I move on to another 4-week block, which is appropriately building towards the end goal. And a microcycle may be 7 days, maybe 10 days, maybe 14 days, depending on the athlete. And that is within the mesocycle, within the 4 weeks, I do some specific stuff each week, maybe. So that's the language. And again, I don't want to get caught up in the language too much because it's for youngsters, it's not quite as complicated. And as coaches, we shouldn't make stuff complicated. We should just make sure we're doing the right things to build a plan. We need to also think about volume, intensity, and recovery. That is fundamentally what I would say. We need to always think whatever we're doing, is it appropriate in how many jumps and throws and all these things we're trying to do, how hard we're asking people to do it, and how much recovery we're going to give them. And that will vary for every individual. But what we should constantly do is we should monitor and evaluate how effective our training's being, and whether that is in terms of physical, technical, emotional development. We should always constantly say to ourselves, just because it's written down on paper, it doesn't mean that actually we have to always do it. If I write down something that my athletes are going to do in 4 weeks' time, but as I constantly monitor and evaluate the training, I feel that actually maybe that's just a little bit too challenging, or actually the opposite, it might be too easy, I might then adapt the training. So constantly monitoring and evaluating the success of the plans we put in place is fundamental, and we need to always be aware of that. So it needs to be something around this where we look at training, and in some respects we look at performing. We do a big evaluation, and that helps us create a new plan. And that could be over a whole year for more experienced athletes, or that could be in terms of constantly going through this cycle. So for me, it would be we watch them train, we watch how they're improving. That's our evaluation. And we review whether the plan is accurate, and that helps us build the next 4-week phase as such. So I'll give you a broad example of what a cycle might look like. So a single periodized year. So this is the bit where our big competition may be around July, August time. And that could probably relate to most people typically in a normal year, where you've got your British trials, you've got your English schools, all them sort of things happen in July, August time. Your world champs, your Olympics tend to happen early August. So if we then build our plan back from there, because it's always good to build back from the end goal. So you back chain it as such. We need to say that in September, October time, we're starting to do general stuff, getting fitter, stronger, working on general condition, and that's our preparation phase. We've got our general preparation phase and our specific preparation phase, which is about getting them conditioning in. And then as we get close to competition, we have pre-competition and competition. And essentially, just to explain, so general is about general conditioning, specific is about specific to the events that you're doing, pre-competition is about preparation to make sure all the things are in line to be ready to compete, and then your competition phase is making sure you can maintain everything to compete well. Double periodized year, very much the same, but it throws in the challenge of you're trying to do that twice in a given year. So you have shorter amount of times to prepare in each phase. And you're probably looking to peak around I'd say in more modern days, probably around February, March time. So the World Indoors was planned for March this year. So if that was your goal, it would probably been February, March time that you peak for. But this is, if you're working with athletes that higher end, probably the latter part of youth and certainly going into seniors, these are typical plans that you would look to develop over a year. They are challenging. I will not deny that, but they are very, very fruitful and useful when you're actually planning future years and sitting down to discuss with your athletes. And we're a strange sport. If we only compete outdoors every year and we don't let athletes compete indoors, for example, they stop competing in August and then they don't compete again until April. That's just a long time to be training for without any specific goals and drivers and plans in place. So just think about how you're building for the bigger picture here. So how do we work out whether we need a really structured periodized plan or not? When I was looking through what's the ideal sort of like plan here on coming up with that, and as I say, this presentation initially didn't have lots and lots of slides in it. So I looked through some of the old slides and found this one, which was produced by Peter Thompson, who worked many years ago within UK Athletics and the IAAF at that time as well. He used a model that I believe had been developed from a few others around determining the structure of an annual plan. And so what he asked is, if you look at the chronological age of the athlete, and we've got the various ones up there, 6 to 9 years of age, 9 to 12 years of age, and so on. And then you ask yourself, are they an early, average, or late maturer? We can start to build an understanding of what is appropriate. Do they need a plan or not? We can then look at that estimated biological age as well. So if we know that they are 12 to 15 years, but they are an early maturer, we might see that they're actually slightly more, and we're talking about physical maturation, we might say that they're actually further on in terms of biological age. Once we know that, we should ask ourselves some really pertinent questions, which is, do they have the basic fundamental skills, the ABCs, the run, jump, throw skills that underpin that? If they don't, then we should still be giving them general periodized training or no periodized training, sorry, I should say, because they need to build all their foundation skills. And so asking them to try and peak for a certain point, it doesn't mean they're not competing, just let me be clear. When we're saying periodized training or not periodized training, if kids want to compete, we should be allowing them to do it. It was just we're not changing the training to make sure that it tapers off and it peaks at a certain given point in the year. But if they do have them foundation skills and we do see that they are in a particular age group, we can then ask ourselves the question, have they got the appropriate training age? And so what training age is I might be physically mature, I might be the right age, but I might not be that experienced in the world of athletics. So let's use more technical events like throwing the hammer or doing steeplechase or doing hurdles or doing pole vault. They're all quite technical events, and having more experience combined with maturation, etc., means I'm probably better positioned to start competing at a high level because I've got the right sort of foundation skills in place. So this model is a really good one, and as I say, we're sharing this as a PDF. So what I would encourage you to do is, when you're looking at planning for your athletes, ask yourself the following questions. Where are they chronologically? Where are they in their maturation and their estimated biological age? Do they have the basic skills, the fundamental skills? And do they also have appropriate training age to withstand the types of training that we may give them in a more structured periodized training program? And then, is it suitable in terms of types of training they're doing? It's a really nice model for you to reflect and challenge yourself to say, have I built it in the right way? It might not resolve all the questions, but I certainly think it'll help orientate the way you pull the plan together. The other thing, and this is more for the youngsters, I just want to bring up. So I see in the previous presentation a reference to Jean Coté, who is a Canadian-French researcher who has done an amazing amount of work in terms of youth development across the world. He's been involved in lots of athlete development models. And John talked about the types of activities, the types of things that kids should be doing. And he looked at, there's a model that exists, and many of you may have heard of the 10,000 hour rule. And the 10,000 hour rule essentially states that you need 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, so practicing to play a piano or to do a certain thing, to master that skill. And there are arguments that some people can get there a lot quicker, but it's an average of 10,000 hours of practice. But deliberate practice can be quite boring because it is very focused and doesn't always engage the audience. And John brought out this model many years ago, and I think it's a brilliant model when you're working youngsters to say, what about deliberate play? Can we change that philosophy and say deliberate play should be the focus when they're young? Because practice could be boring, but play could be actually something that you engage with. And so just to define the difference between deliberate play and deliberate practice is like doing a series of specifically designed drills to master a particular skill. Deliberate play is allowing them to explore through play the types of movements that you want them to develop, but you structure the game and the activity so it's more fun and engaging. So his argument, and I'm a big fan of this particular model in terms of the working with youngsters, is in the early years, up until about the age of 12, he classifies these as the sampling years. And he encourages it should be very high in deliberate play and low in deliberate practice. So they should be doing several sports. They should be doing lots of activities and engaging in fun ways. And when they then get to the next part, so when they're probably moving from primary to secondary school, we should hopefully see that some kids move into more recreational years. So they still want to do the play and low deliberate practice because they don't want to do competitive sport, but they still want to be physically active and engaging. So these are, I'd almost say that these are your adult five-a-side footballers at a later stage who don't want to be the next Premiership superstar, but they still want to play football because they quite enjoy it and stay fit. It's probably that younger age group where these are the types of kids what plays like games on the playground, but don't necessarily want to join a club. You then got the other sampling area, which is the specialising years. So these are the people who have probably joined your clubs and they're moving into that play and practice balance. It's a little bit of trying to get an even balance here. So it's less involvement in several sports. They might have picked one or two clubs to join, which is really effective. And as they move through, probably around the 14, 15, which aligns with our GCSE age group for children when they're starting to choose whether they want to do PE or not. This is probably when it's more high deliberate practice, so more structured training, more drill-based activities, and low deliberate play. There are still elements of play in there, and they're probably focusing on one sport, and we're still probably focusing on an event group in this particular model. There is concern, the purple bit down the side, just to explain, is the concern that Jean and the other researchers raise around if you do one sport from a very young age and there is low deliberate play, high deliberate practice, and probably that is defined as early specialization, there has been some research to say that can increase the dropout rate. So probably we should ask ourselves the question, because we know, not just athletics, but across the board, all sports know, certain points, young people drop out of sport. And they tend to be around, in some cases, around the 12 years and sometimes around the 14 to 16 years. And is it because things have become too serious where they still want to have fun and they still want to play? So this is the bit where we need to look at competitions we offer and the training we offer. Are we structuring a program that fits the needs of everybody? So some athletes may not want to invest the amount of training it takes to get to a national championships because it's a big investment. They just like running or jumping or throwing. So it may be that the training is different for them and the expectations are different for them. Okay, so I just want to share the benefits of planning and then I pause and throw it out again for some questions from the audience. The benefits of planning for me, the initial thoughts of obviously writing a training program can seem quite large, a bit of time consuming really and a bit of a challenge, but this does not have to be the case. Like what I would say is, and I'll share my experience, when I first started coaching, I looked back at all the training programs that my coach had wrote for me, and they helped me a lot. Now I've changed a lot of things that I do, but they were a really good sort of example to build from. And there are examples that exist, and I'm going to show you a few in a moment for the younger age group. And there's lots of stuff that we do through coach education, through development. The trick is always find the ones what are good sort of like templates and examples of how to structure a training program, but make sure they're appropriately structured for your athletes. So you need that element of understanding what you're doing, working off some examples of good practice, but it always needs to be bespoke for the individuals you work for. Okay, and that is really crucial. Don't lift a training program to the next one. And I remember many years ago, Clyde Hart, who coached Michael Johnson at the time, brought over, he come and presented on an event I was organising, talked about certain types of training that Michael Johnson was doing, and then I believe like for the next 2 years, most people started trying to do that same type of training. And my argument was always, well, unless you got Michael Johnson in your group, then it's probably not appropriate. And I'd imagine that Michael Johnson's moved on to that sort of stuff. So know what your structure looks like. Get some inspiration of ideas from others, certainly expertise, and we're hopefully filter that through from an England Athletics point of view and share lots of good practice. But make sure you adapt it for your group, your athletes. That's really key here. Once a club or a coach has developed a training program, they will appreciate the excellent advantages that come with it, including clear understanding of roles and responsibilities for all the coaches, leaders, and volunteers. So when we talk about young groups, like induction groups, as they might be called, or like the real youngsters, there are probably multiple coaches supporting that large group of kids. So us all understanding what our role is on a given night, and what we're looking after and what the kids should expect will make things run a lot easier, and they will make it a lot more rewarding. So planning is really key here in terms of that team collaboration. Athletes come prepared for the activities. They will be covered, so they know almost what to expect, and that might be an exciting thing. So it makes it easier to explain to them what you expect. You can then make sure you're organised. You've got the facilities and the equipment that you require, the timing. You understand how long it's going to take to move around the training session itself. And from the athlete's long-term and development and preparation, it will help in terms of preparing for competitions. And what I would say is, with youngsters, like a lot of the plans that I always look at is, even if there is no scheduled competition, you can do an inter-club competition or intra-club competition at the end of each like term or half term. So when we talk a lot about young people, I use the reference to school terms, because that's the way parents' heads tend to focus, and young people would tend to coordinate. So there's no issue really in September to December saying halfway through, when it's the October half term, rather than doing a typical training night, why not do a sports hall intra-club competition where the kids have a go and see how they're getting on, and all the skills are developing, and test themselves and try and work towards the sports or athletics awards, and then do the same just before Christmas. And then when we get to the outdoor competition period, let's use the English Schools Awards to test kids on a constant basis. So giving them some sort of like goal and structure, doesn't have to be about aspiring to be a superstar. Just give them something that they can look forward to is really helpful. So last probably 3 slides, and then I'll pause and take some questions. So designing a training program, coaches need to consider the following. How many sessions per week do the children attend? So, and I would say it's going to vary. Kids are very flexible, and things do change quite drastically, and certainly in the younger age group. So just try and go for a rule of thumb. How long is each session? So we pretty much will know that, and that might be shorter in the winter. So if you're using indoor facilities, that might be more challenging. What space and equipment is available for each session? So have you got the equipment you need to do all the things that you've got planned? How many children will attend each session on average? So knowing that allows you to orientate the amount of leaders and coaches you might need and try and get the best ratio. How many coaches and leaders have you got? Obviously, that complements the previous point. And are there any competitions coming up, like such as sports or track and field? Now, whilst you're not going to change training drastically, you might add in like speed bounce activities and certain things for sports hall, just to help the kids get ready and understand what they're going to need to do if they go along to one of them competitions. And the same in cross country, there might be an orientation of, if you're doing lots of stuff in the sports hall, we still encourage our club that kids come out and do some runs around the track to finish off the session. So there's an element of endurance. You might increase that if they're doing some cross country stuff as well. Top tips when planning. I think from my point here, when you're looking at it, We've already talked about how long each section of the session, each session will be, but each section, as in how long is your warm up going to be, how long is each activity going to be, and how long is the cool down going to be, is really key, and certainly with a younger age group. So coaches should consider how long it will take children to move between different stations if you're doing more than one event in a given session, and that's quicker indoors because in a sports hall season move around. Outdoors, moving from different parts of the track takes longer. It impacts on how much time you've got to coach the kids. So make sure we've got that planned in our head. We also need to think about refreshment breaks as well, making sure they're hydrating as they go. When working with young athletes, try to ensure that each section is not too long because kids become bored really quickly. And I would add into that as well, when you're introducing the activity, make sure you don't take too long to introduce it. It needs to be something that's quick to get going. If you spend 5 minutes introducing an activity to kids, you'll probably find a lot of them switch off. You need to try and do that in the first 30 seconds, 2 minutes max. Keep it short, sweet, get them going. Even if the game starts going or the activity starts going and they haven't quite got the concept, add in extra points as it goes. Get them going as quickly as possible. Get more practice in if they can. And keep the session varied. Ensure the athletes are active as possible. So I would say we need to really think planning. If we're doing a long jump session, for example, do we really want 10 kids stood in a line waiting to jump further into the pit, or do we want to jump sideways into the pit if safe to do so, or do we want to give them other activities? So 4 kids are jumping into the pit while the other 8 kids are practicing run-ups on the track or practicing high skips to get height when they take off. Just try and be creative with how we can keep everybody as active as possible. Registration, one of the things I like to talk about is try and make it easy. So these are things that are ideal that they might not be feasible, might not be possible, but certainly when youngsters are new, I talk about name labels for both the coach and the athlete, certainly with the younger age group, not with athletes who train with a coach all the time. The reason for this is about building rapport quickly with kids, because if you know their name, then it does resonate with them and it's easier to have a conversation with them. If you, rather than saying you can say, Scott, can you focus on this? Then the athlete really appreciates that. And there's this element as well around, I used to encourage, and if it's feasible, signing out policies. And for me, that was the definitive of, when I turn up as a coach, I want time to set up the environment, make sure it's ready to go so we can get going and we can maximize the coaching session we deliver. If I take control of the kids 10, 15 minutes early before the session officially starts because the parents say, I need to go, the problem is that then I'm managing the kids as well as trying to organize the activity. So we talk about a sign in and sign out, where the coach takes responsibility as soon as they've been signed in and we're ready to get them going. So it just allows time for people to prepare. And I know some people on the webinar are going to be like, okay, that's ideal, but that's not feasible. Have it down as an idea that maybe in the future you could trial, because I think it could help. So group control, as I say, I'll stop after this one. So group control, when attempting to gain control, probably the natural thing we're going to do is blow a whistle or shout. But what you start to find is if that's the only way you communicate to get control, then kids don't really see the difference when you really have to stop them in an emergency. So I always like to think to myself that if I'm going to shout stop all of a sudden, that people know if I've done that, it's for a real good reason. So it's almost like an emergency or a safety reason. So what I try to do is I vary the way that I try and get the group to listen to me. So one of the things we try to do is non-verbal ones. So you might say at the very beginning of a session, right, whenever I want you to stop and listen for the next bit of instructions to do this activity, I'm going to put my hand in the air, which is what a lot of teachers do in schools with younger age group, or I might hold the Usain Bolt lightning pose. And what you find is it does work brilliantly. It seems like crazy, but when you do it, you'll find that a few kids suddenly stop and look at you and hold the same pose. And then after a few moments, there's a ripple effect where they all start doing that. And what that means is they've suddenly stopped. They're all looking at you and you can give them the next instruction rather than shouting, trying to shout over lots of kids, trying to control that group and bring them in. It's a really good way to get crowd control. So that's that sort of like high level sort of things to think about when you're planning. Can you plan in what you're going to say at the beginning of each session and sort of ideas that you can flow through? Because after you've used that approach 2 or 3 weeks in a row, you find that you don't need to do the instruction of this is what I'm going to do to get your attention. You just hold a Usain Bolt pose or hand in the air, and kids will stop and listen to you straight away. So these are hopefully useful things for those working with kids at this moment in time. I'm going to pause for a quick question, probably take 1 or 2. So over to Spencer to bring them up on screen. How do you deal with coaches who are anti-sports or not consider this as part of athletics? So I would say it's an interesting one, Richard, to almost try and understand why they believe that like sports is not a good thing. I've had the absolute honour, I was going to say privilege, but it's an absolute honour to have several conversations with George Bunner, who created Sports Hall. And George created that around the challenge that he faced, where there was no access to athletics tracks and kids were training out in the cold, and he wanted to find a creative way to bring them indoors and do some very exciting stuff and come up with lots of different concepts. If you look at the movement skills that they develop in sports or athletics, they're all running, they're all jumping, they're all throwing. We teach them good pushing skills through the Medball Challenge. We teach them good overarm pulling skills, what can convert into javelin. Speed bounce, we teach them fast foot contact. We teach them jumping for height, jumping for distance. We teach them very good fundamental skills. And if you look at the concept of sports, so it's very much that team-based that somebody mentioned earlier on. I believe it was Rachel, around like really trying to drive competition in terms of teams. It was around that ability for kids to like take on multiple challenges and have fun. And I would say, for me, I always ask somebody this question of like, will you tell me why you don't think it's worthwhile? And I'll give you 10 reasons why I think it's worthwhile. And actually, probably the most important people to measure is the kids, because I know for a fact that like lots of kids do not want to be training outside in the middle of winter when we know it can be freezing cold. And I know other athletes will do. If we can get them doing sports or athletics, they absolutely love that, the inspiration. We know lots of people, if you speak to George, he will quote multiple people who have done sports all in their lifetime, including the likes of Paula Radcliffe, who done sports all when she was younger. It just shows you that actually it's a really good way of engaging people. And the amount of schools that I speak to every year at various conferences who are desperate to run that sports or competition, it is like a fixed part of school environment, and we should really embrace it. I would challenge the coaches to just rationalize why they don't think it's worth it. Because I'm sure Richard, yourself, and many other people in this webinar have got lots of reasons why they would strongly support it. But also, the kids are the ones who are going to vote the most. They'll vote with their feet. If they really didn't think sports all was worth doing, then they wouldn't do it. And I would find it hard to find many kids who don't really want to engage with that competition. I think the one other thing to add into that is, and one thing I know sports will are great at like promoting, again, is as well as competition, sports will have their awards programs, so we can look at how we can motivate every kid. So like in certain competitions, we can turn up and it's the best person wins, and that's the way competition finishes. With sports hall, because you've also got the sports hall awards, 60 kids can take part in a sports hall competition. You might have a winner overall for boy and girl, but you also will have potentially all 60 of them kids get a sports hall award and go away in a positive manner. So I think brilliant. And Liana Cazo is sharing with Sophie Hitchin, Phillips Ado were sports hall kids too. I think like there's lots of people we could share as examples. So if it wasn't worthwhile, it certainly has impacted positively on a lot of young people. Great question, Richard. Hopefully you get more like positive responses. During half term, would you encourage training during the morning or in the day instead of in the? Well, I think I'm being like joined by my son, who's come in to just say hello. So working from home has fun. This is my son Jackson, and he's going to run off now so I can get around with my webinar. Apologies for about that, everybody. So, it wasn't quite the Sky News where the parent comes running in and grabbing the kid. It was quite entertaining. During the half term, would you encourage training during the morning or in the day instead of the evening to get the bodies used to performing at different times of the day during competition? That is a great question. And I would say yeah, Jack, from my point of view, we should try and vary it. I think we work on typically training on certain times in the evening because that's when everybody's finished school, finished work. So your 7 till half 8 is typically where we would do it. But actually, as Jack's quite clearly said there, we compete at different times in the competition day. So for me, I would say that's where weekends are really useful. I tend to try and orientate some of the training that I do at the weekend with my athletes to be at like various times where typically they would compete. I think when you work with higher level athletes, you certainly want to try and orientate that very specifically. I think days is really important as well. So for me, if your body is used to always training on a Sunday, it's probably more akin to being comfortable competing on a Sunday. If you always do your training on Saturday and then you compete all of a sudden on Sunday, it's a little bit like probably as we're all finding as coaches now, being at home on a Tuesday and Thursday evening. I don't even know what TV is supposed to be on at that time because it's so alien to me, so alien to my body. So I would, if you could, adapt it, but obviously you have to work within can the athletes get to the training at that time? Have you as a coach got the capacity to vary it? Certainly in the week. Obviously, with the younger age group in the half term period, there's great opportunities where certain clubs might be running holiday schemes as well, which might vary the types of training they can access. Good question, bit of a challenge, and one I think probably each coach needs to tackle individually. One more question, and then we'll get back on the presentation. So Carl, great question. And Power 10, I think is an amazing website, and I think if used correctly, is a really useful website. So I don't think necessarily the Power 10 is the issue. I think it's how we embrace that. What I would say, however, is I have encouraged the idea of us looking at Power 10 and having two different types of ranking. At this moment in time, it ranks you on performance. I would love to see that it also could rank you with a click of a button. You could change what appears on your screen to ranked at who's improved the most from last year. Because that would be something where it goes back to that who's improving is as much as like really important, certainly for the long term, as to who's performing at the very best. So ideally a click of the button which would say that I might be in terms of performance ranked outside the top 100, but actually if you compare my performances last year to this year, I'm probably in the top 10, would give me some level of motivation. I think also what I would like to see probably more in Power 10 is we have the top 10 ranking and the top 100 bars. I'd like to see the integration of awards within there. So as an athlete, I could see how far I'm moving along, so I can see stepping stones. Because athletes do compare themselves against everybody else. They do compare themselves on the ranking. I think how we use Power 10 and how parents and athletes use Power 10 is really important here. So a level of education around this is just in terms of like a performance measurement at this moment in time. How you use it is key to how powerful it can be. Okay, so we're going to pause there. Great questions. Keep them coming as always. Thanks, Spencer. So just moving on with the presentation itself. A few other top tips. I'm going to use this one now. Clubs should ideally try to work on a 1:12 ratio, or 12:1 ratio, I should say. So 12 athletes, ideally to one coach. And where you can, bring in parents and volunteers to try and help decrease that ratio. Now, I know for sure that people will say, that's just not manageable, Scott. That's just not feasible. We have like 20, 25 kids each session. And I completely understand that. What I would encourage is like a little bit of education around to the parents to encourage them to help out. Is that if you took a 60-minute training session and you had like 20 kids in there, you break that down. That's only 3 minutes that you could give to attention to each child if you use the whole 60-minute spectrum. If you got a leader in there to help you, and you halve that down to you working with 10 and a leader or another coach working with 10 individuals, you double the time that you can spend with each individual, up to 6 minutes. Now, 6 minutes doesn't seem a lot, but it's a big difference, and it's one of them ones where what I always want to say is lots of people work really hard to get a coaching qualification and develop the skills to be an effective coach. But if you spend most of your time crowd managing and not coaching, then the kids aren't really getting everything that you've got in terms of expertise and your passion, at the same time as you're sort of like managing the crowd, and the parents' expectations of what's going to be like given in a given session changes. So I know it's a challenge, but I think this is one of the ones where I'd really encourage clubs to say, well, could we manage it? Could we look at like getting more parents engaged? And volunteering and asking people to volunteer is a big challenge. But I think if you explain to parents, look, if you help out, this is a benefit to your child and other children, you sometimes get like a pretty positive response. So I'm not going to say it's easy to achieve, but I'm going to throw it out there as just a suggestion. So getting into a bit of more than the nitty gritty. So for this is for youngsters, and this is a suggested structure if I was to build for particularly the younger age group. Planning for youth development, I'd look at the annual plan, which is what am I going to do over the year? Okay, so and what I tend to do is with the youngsters, I tend to go in standard blocks. I don't talk about mesocycles, microcycles, all the common language you probably hear in planning, high end stuff. And all I say to myself is, typically in an ideal scenario, if we could get access to an indoor facility for the younger age group between September and December, and probably the same for January to March, because of the weather that we have in the UK, it would be ideal. So I use the example of my own club. We tend to get into a sports hall or an indoor facility probably November onwards, all the way through to March. Why do we do that? Well, kids certainly enjoy training indoors in the warm as opposed to out in the freezing cold in the rain. So there's a positive aspect to that. It allows us to do lots of more quality stuff because we're not having to deal with the variable conditions outside. And it complements a lot of stuff that they will probably do if they're doing a level of competition, i.e. sports, that we mentioned earlier on. The lengths of training periods, if you look at school term, it's probably going to be including the half terms if you were doing that, and the term breaks, so Christmas time, etc. It's roughly 12 to 16 weeks a training program you need to develop for the indoors, and then it's probably like quite a bit longer because obviously we have the summer holidays in the outdoor period, so between April and August. And what you could do is you could add in between each of these. We could do more like holiday scheme activities if there's capacity to do that at a club, where there's a bit more bespoke training in the half-term breaks and the holiday schemes, which could be a great revenue generator for clubs if they can do that themselves. But it's a great way of engaging with the kids you've already got in the club and potentially new members. Typically, for the younger age group, I'd expect to see these sort of sessions lasting 60 to 90 minutes and maybe 1 to 2 sessions per week, depending on the kids turning up. And as I say, the encouragement would be, types of focus would be sports or competitions because they fit with the environment that they'll be training in. Great competitions to do in controlled space and with adapted equipment. And then a lot of people still use quad kids out there, or a track and field version of quad kids. And as I say, England Athletics are working with our friends in sports hall to develop a new competition where we will see that measure everybody's improvement. So that'll be an outdoor format in the first instance. So just that's a very big picture. That's how I'd sketch it out initially and go, that's what I want to do. That's the environments I'm going to be working in ideally. And that's roughly how long I need to plan for. The next step it should hopefully get me to is something like this. And just to say, the previous slide, this slide are in useful resources that you can download on the 365 app, and also I believe some of these documents are still on the England Athletics website. If not, I'll make sure that they are put on there again to help you plan an indoor and outdoor program for 16 weeks and 22 weeks outdoors. So typically what I would do is I would segment what am I going to have to do for each section of the actual day. So we've got down there, we've got registration. If we're doing a registration process, 10 minutes before the session starts, first 10 minutes might be some sort of group activity where they all come together. If there are late arrivals, they just join straight in and they can get active and warmed up. And it has really positive impact there. So that's that contact setting. And then what we do is we then move them into, in this scenario, there are 4 10-minute stations that they quickly move through. We may say, actually, we want to go 3 15-minute stations. We may want to change it around. So this is more just giving you a bit of a structure. And then at the end, we might finish with some fun relays, or we might finish with them going out and doing some steady running around the track for 5 to 10 minutes and see how far they can get in that given time. So a good way to engage. And what I've tried to do is show that actually over the 12-week period, we've scheduled in 2 indoor awards / competition weeks where that's about how you're getting on, how are you managing to develop skills and like test yourself, have a bit of fun, and almost like a reward part, which would reflect roughly about half-term time and the full term. So lots of different stuff. This is very much a blend of hitting all the various points of the 365 program, and this is trying to give variety, but you may change the way you do it. So you do 2 weeks of exactly the same activities, so you allow chance for the kids to learn them skills. And how it may lay out, and again, this is in the resource, this is my my attempt of showing how you can lay out these various stations in a sports hall. So we've got the rough timing there. We've got like 4 stations of showing how you could lay it out if you had a big enough sports hall, and directions of throwing into the wall, making sure you're throwing away from anything else, how many mats and little rubber markers you might use, or speed bounce or standing long jump mats you need, and then sort of activities you can do, and a more detailed look at that might look something along the line of this. So within that resource, it sort of gives you an idea of like safety tips to consider, the equipment you might require. So I'm just going to move on to 2 more slides, and I know some questions are coming through. So if we can hold fire for a moment, and then I'll come to them if that's okay. So again, this is an outdoor version. So the outdoor version, the times are slightly longer. So we've gone for 20 minutes for the activities here for long jump and for sustained running. And the reason being that in this particular area, so my assistants join me again. So bear with me. So yeah, in terms of like this section, we've got 20 minutes, which allows us to move between different stations. And it allows us to actually just like run more productive sessions. So remember, if you're working on a track as opposed to a sports hall, there's lots of moving around, which will take time. Never cameo, that's my wife and that. Okay, so again, this is how it's laid out. So this shows you different ways of doing it. Again, this appears in the resource. And what it will show you is, if you look at the example there of long jump, we're jumping into the side of the pit as opposed to typically jumping the full length of the pit. So this is just different ways to vary it. And again, this is all in like some resources which are free to download, and hopefully will support coaches. What we've also added like recently in terms of the 365 XL package is a little bit more like a bit more structure to that. So you've got a very similar sort of layout. These are sort of like the things that we expect people to do. But what we've done instead is giving you an alternative version where you do the same activities for the first 2 sessions or first 2 like weeks it might be. So running for speed and jumping for distance. And then we move on to running for speed. So we still keep that momentum going, but we change it to a pull throw. And so we do 2 activities a session. And typically it shows you how it's laid out like this. So lots of different things. This is how to structure it. These different activities and games people could use. These are the session aims, and these are the safety tips in general to think about. And then on this particular layout, on the second page, we also give some tips in terms of coaching tips, how to ask questions to help the children with their learning. So it might be how this is about making them more aware of what they're doing, and then how to simplify or make it more challenging. Because essentially, with any structured plan, you're going to turn up, you have a plan. Some kids will find it too easy and get bored, so we need to challenge them and throw them a different challenge. And some will find it too hard, and so we need to simplify it so they still feel engaged. So this resource is part of the 365 Excel resource we've now made free for the next 12 months to all coaches and leaders. So yeah, have a look at this sort of stuff. Hopefully what I hope it does is help you with planning. And for me, this goes back to my point earlier on. This is more about giving you examples to work from. You might look at this and go, I like it, but I'm going to change it to my own way of doing it. But we wanted to give you something that's really useful for you to develop from. So I'm going to pause there because the last part is really like how it would look on a given session, how you take that big picture and focus it down. Like if we can take two questions from the audience. Thanks, Spencer. How do you determine an appropriate number of competitions in a season at under 13, under 15 level? Duncan, really good question. I'd almost throw it back and say, what's the purpose of the competition? I remember like writing an article quite a few years ago about there was concern that young people are over competing, and I sort of say so. There is an argument the closest thing possible to a competition in terms of training is competing, whether that's in your own group against other like training partners, or whether that is going to a competition itself. So I use sometimes competitions like on a Wednesday night and say to my group, that's your speed training session for this week, because that's about as good as example of you working in a competitive situation. So for under 13s, under 15 levels, I would say we want them to have enough time to develop skill. So we don't want them to compete every week because they need the chance to practice the skills that you're teaching them, they're learning, for that to embed and for them to be able to use that for the next competition. So the way YDLs are structured allows that nice space in between time for kids to have a chance to practice. But you could still use other competitions such as time trial, like speed events, what happen at like Lee Valley or Watford Open meetings that happened in the south, etc., to let them test out where they're getting on in training. But it shouldn't be the focus of it. I think what we need to do as coaches is try and get that balance of, am I going to change my training for this week to integrate a competition as part of training? Because if I go along and do 2 100-meter sprints in a competition, that might be what replaces my, I don't know, 3 sets of 3 times 40-meter starts with my training partners. It might be that that's the replication. So I think a nice balance of giving them enough time to learn the skill and then be able to apply that. But maybe think about, is competition an addition to training, or could we use competition as part of training? Hopefully, like, I know that wasn't quite like given specific numbers, but hopefully that's like one what help. It would be interesting to hear your views on parents observing training sessions. It's great that parents want to watch their kids train, but often we find that it can cause challenges. For example, parents coaching from sideline. After completing an activity, athletes looking to parents for feedback rather than coach. Just a couple of examples. We find our group trains better when parents are sometimes a distance away. So I've been around lots of colleagues. One of my colleagues in Germany just said, no, parents can't come into the venue. I think parents are an integral part. I think like what we got to do is probably set some rules. And I know like football have got lots of guidelines about how parents should conduct themselves on the sideline. Like I'd almost want to like educate the parents around the importance of certain things, that how they act and what they do. So go back to that bit around relative age effect and saying if parents were aware of this, it would help them. I think if parents realize some of the challenges that you've raised, Daniel, I think it would probably, if you say, look, this can help or hinder your children engage, then that's the key part. So, for example, I wouldn't expect any parent to sit at the back and start telling their kid how to do something in front of a teacher. The teacher is leading that session. In an athletics environment, you're the coach, you're leading the session, and that's what you're focusing on. So it really needs to be one of them ones where you are the focal point. So I would say to parents, look, these are the rules. We'd love if you got some stuff that you want to talk to us about, any ideas that you think you could really help with helping your child. Let us know at the end of the session. Come and have a chat with us, because then that gives them an opportunity for them to speak direct to you without feeling that like you're shutting them down. But at the same time, think about how you're setting up the sessions and where you're positioning yourself. So if you're trying to give them a really good, important message, make sure that their backs are away from like anything what might distract them. Might be parents, might be other training groups, and their focus is on you. And the only thing behind you might just be a brick wall. So their attention has to look at you. So, hey, like I said earlier on, like in my time as a coach, lots of parents have been brilliant. They've really engaged, and I have a lot of time from with the group I've got at the moment, amazing bunch of people. But we've got to work with parents, and they've got to work with us. Final question then. After this question, Okay, Spencer said after this question we'll be back for a break. So, um, okay, so I think that's really it from my point of view. As I say, the final part, Spencer, if I can have the screen again before everybody disappears off to get a coffee, is I'm going to go back to this part. Is just to finish off, and hopefully everybody's still there. Great. So it's the approach that we take now when we deliver. So typically when you work with young people, we do one of a couple of extremes. We do a game-based activity. So we see lots of fun stuff taking place with leaders and that engaging. But sometimes what that lacks is an element of skill learning. They're easy to set up. So you can play a game, and like Domes and Dishes, Cups and Saucers is a game I see played a lot. My question I always ask is, what's the purpose of that game? What are you trying to achieve through that game? And so that's something that I think we need to do. We don't just play a game. We need to have a purpose for it. The other end of the spectrum we see in terms of the coaching approach with youngsters is specialize in training too early. So more adult orientated type stuff, where the kids might not have the foundation skills to do it. It's not always that exciting. And the outcome is really outcome driven. How quick are you running this? How fast are you doing these protection reps? What I want to see in terms of coaching with young people is this right down the middle. Developmental coaching is about fun, but it's also progressive. Okay, it should be skill-based learning, so they should learn something, and it should be stage-related coaching. But we also make sure we empower the athletes to actually get a greater understanding of what they're doing. So I think like what we need to do is not just play games. We need to know why we're doing a particular activity. That deliberate play that Jean Cote references. If we're looking at doing skills and more adult training, is that appropriate to where the athlete is? And make sure we get to this middle bit of it needs to be fun, but it needs to be progressive. So I always need to feel that I'm getting better as a young person. It needs to be skill and conditioning based. So I'm actually feel like I'm getting better condition and learning a new skill. It needs to relate to my stage as opposed to anything else. And we need to empower them, coach the athletes to learn their own skills. And typically, you might do it along this. This is a example. We do a warm up, and kids might go after a run, jump, throw activity, which could be push golf, which I was playing with my kids in the back garden yesterday. Just a fun one for the really youngsters. But like one of the reasons why I picked push golf is that with this, if you don't manage to get the target in 2 throws, and that's the handicap we've given for that hole, and you have to take more attempts. The kids what need more practice are probably the ones what are taking more attempts. So they get more practice, which is good for skill learning. So it's a good game to do that. And it's not just a case of pushing an object. But like once we've mastered that, we may move into a more skill-based activity and say we're going to use something like a shot put grid. And there's more information about this within various resources that I'll reference later on. Or we might use a throws line grid that athletes can throw in. Similar. Triple jump grids, brilliant. So jumping in the side of the pit, and again, we're structuring that. So this is a jumping activity we may set. And then one of my favorite games that I love doing because it just makes people feel really good is beat the clock, which is rather than just saying this is a 100-meter race or a 60-meter race for kids, I basically get kids to line up using their preference of start. Could be standing or lean, could be a falling start, could be a 3-point or even a crouch start. And it's how far you can run in the time that I've set on my stopwatch, which is normally 9.58 seconds or 10.49 seconds for obvious reasons. And so it's just a good way of kids running and not being bothered about who wins. They're more bothered about how far they manage to get. So it starts to get that focus back on them. Okay, so I think we're gonna that's the end of this presentation here, and I believe we are pretty much on time. So I'm just going to finish with that. It's tough, but it's worth doing planning. So that's a really good way to look at planning. So this bit is like next session starts in half an hour. I'll probably take 2 questions, Spencer, if you can throw them on screen, and then we'll pause. And again, as I say, I'll answer all the others as soon as possible after today. I'm not sure if my co-presenter is still there, so I'm going to look at Darren Taplin. What percent? Oh, yeah, there we go. Very good. What percentage of ABCs and 365 drills would you devote to an event group session or for the athletes no longer doing sports all? So I would say it depends on where each athlete is. Like what I would argue is if I haven't got the coordination or the stability, balance to do a particular, or haven't got them skills, I'm not going to be able to do other movements efficiently. So if I use an example of when we run, we land on a leg, and if we're not stable through the hip, the knee, and the ankle joint, I'm using my arm obviously to represent my leg because I'm sat down. Um, if I'm not stable through these joints because I haven't got good balance or I haven't got good control, then it's going to mean that I collapse in them particular areas. So I'm not going to be as efficient as running. If I haven't got coordination, so I can't get the timing right in terms of rhythm, in terms of a run up or times of timing when I'm trying to throw an object like a javelin, it's going to massively impact on that particular area. If I'm trying to do like some form of rotation in terms of throwing a discus and I'm off balance because the ABCs aren't there, then I think it's still a critical area that we should look at. I think as you go through puberty as well, you obviously need to keep coming back and revisiting these areas because as I grow, I might have a shorter arm that gradually grows through puberty. So my understanding of how far away my arms are when I throw a discus or how long my legs are when I'm doing a particular skill massively changes. So I would say that in terms of the ABCs, I still keep them as part of my fundamental training. It might be that you just use them as part of your drills in terms of your warm up. And again, with 365 drills, it might be some of them you're using as part of your warm up. So the athletes I work with who are in their teens and through to seniors, they still do an element of can they do slow calf raises? Can they do controlled squats? Can they do holding like their core in a good position just to like set themselves up prior to starting the warm up? We do lots of reactive stuff. We integrate a lot of the 365 challenges into a warm up routine because essentially it's preparing the body for what comes next. So needs to vary with your athletes, needs to vary as they go through puberty quite drastically as well, but still integral part of getting them to the end. One more question and then we'll take a break. Much broader question, Scott, but what long-term effects do you think coronavirus will have on youth training and athletics in general? So it's a really good question, and I think like obviously we're all working in the very much unknown. I think it's going to change culture, it's going to change society massively. I think if I was to pull out some real positives that I hope that it does, it will help coaches be even more creative than they've ever been, and help them solve problems more than they've ever done before. It gives us a great opportunity in some respects because we can really upskill ourselves and make sure the knowledge we take back is fundamental. I think for youngsters that they are being creative, they are finding ways to do training at home, and they are becoming even more resilient. And I think for me the key part is trying to keep that social connection with your training groups. You know, they've got to see your face from time to time because like lots of like Dina Asher Smith has said it before. She sees John Blackier, coach, as almost like a father figure. And you look at that and you go, so that you've got to try and keep that contact where you can with your group. But yeah, be creative, throw different like challenges at them. Like my group have decided that they're all going to come up with different ab workouts that we're going to do on that Tuesday and Thursday. I'm not sure how well my abs are going to cope with that, but it's a good challenge. But hey, when you're challenged with things like this, and we don't know when we can get back to training, hopefully sooner rather than later, it's going to have a big effect on us all. Whether it's like direct impact on our loved ones or on the way we work. I think what I have been personally amazed with is just the way that the coaching community, the volunteer community, all the clubs, the athletes, even the elite athletes, sharing their training online. I think that sort of stuff is just very inspirational. And I think as coaches, what I'd encourage you to do is almost act as the filter to say, right, guys, have you seen this? Have you seen that? We can really learn from this. That a bit where they're probably looking at you going, help me. You know, I'm chatting with my athletes a lot on WhatsApp and they're going, what can I do? You know, so we're being challenged as coaches to be creative. I think we'll be better individuals when we get back on the track. I think your athletes will be very, very resilient, very determined. I think probably the biggest challenge it will some people will face is competition and whether they're going to be able to compete in certain events. The ones that I feel will probably struggle a lot are those who in their last year maybe doing the English schools or maybe had a focus if they were at a higher end of doing a specific competition like the European under-18s or something along that. If this was their only year to do that and they move on, obviously they feel disappointed. But what I'd always say to them is, like, you're a great athlete. If you're considering that, there's always new goals for you to push on to. So yeah, hopefully that was helpful. So I do think it's a brilliant question. I'm constantly asking myself that as a coach, as a professional working for England Athletics, and I think, look, we're an athletic community. We've built a massive community together. Let's keep on using that, sharing good practice. I'm sure people come up with different ways beyond house party and the different ideas were all being shared. So hopefully that's helpful for yourselves. I'm conscious we've got 20 minutes before the next presentation, so let's take a break. Great stuff, everybody, and I'll see you in about 20 minutes. Thank you ever so much.